I don't care if it rains or freezes, as long as I have my plastic Jesus on the dashboard of my car. Will you join me in that? I don't care if it rains or freezes, as long as I have my plastic Jesus on the dashboard of my car. Now, many of you have never heard that hymn, certainly not the rendition that I have given it. And I do want to apologize ahead of time with anyone who has a Roman Catholic background, because that song has made its way into the popular market. But there's another reason why I would like to emphasize and focus on this particular hymn or song. It isn't really a hymn, it's a song. And the reason I want to focus on it is that you and I have been caught up in exactly what this particular song tells us. And that is that we think that if we could only do the right thing, push the right button, use the right key, that we would not have any problems. Or at least we think and believe that we ought to have not only no problems, but that we ought to actually have a life that is smooth. And so we get angry at God at times when he doesn't come across the way we want him to come across. We get angry sometimes because we want God to do what we want him to do. But we find in our text today, which is actually the alternate text in Romans chapter 8, and when we find in that text a very important distinction. Jesus Christ tells the disciples, and here Paul tells the disciples, that there is nothing that they can do in order to gain a good heavenly life. Why is that? Because you see, the focus ought to be on what we understand God to be doing in our lives. And if we put the focus there and try to figure out what God is doing in our lives, we will recognize that in fact you and I are just as guilty and sinful as anyone else who plays that song or doesn't play it at all. And so today I'd like to believe, or at least focus a little bit, that's the part of the sermon I didn't want to give. All things happen for good. That's part of what Paul is saying in this letter to the Romans. Nothing can occur which doesn't in some way allow God to work his way in our lives. But you see, that's not just it. That's not just the end of it. The end of it is that you and I are always prone to want God to be our slave, our serpent, oh yes, even our serpent. We want God to be whom we want him to be, and be there in order to accomplish what we want in our lives. But in this chapter 8 of Romans, we actually read more than that. We also discover that you and I are actually ready to have God intervene in our lives. We just don't want to do it. We don't want to do it because you and I think that we live good lives, and that ought to be good enough for anyone. It ought to be good enough for us to actually lead a life that is good and therefore rewarded by God. So, what are the things? What does Paul say? Paul tells us that you and I don't have to worry anymore about getting into heaven, because there's nothing that we can do to stop it, and there's nothing that we can do to facilitate it. What we recognize in this statement by Paul, what we recognize is that you and I have already done everything that needs to be done in our lives. But, you see, that doesn't mean that we don't have choices to make. We definitely have choices to make in order to not facilitate our getting into heaven, but to lift up what we need to do in our lives. We need to lift up our lives and bring them to Jesus, because if we refuse to do that, then there is no hope. There is no hope unless you and I are ready to say, Jesus is my God. Not the new tractor that I bought, not the new car that I bought. Nothing will actually get us anywhere except if we make the right choice, which is in Jesus. Remember when I was a kid first coming over here to the United States, I often wanted to play baseball, except I didn't know what baseball was. In Germany, we have such a thing as hit ball, but it isn't really hit ball at all. And I wanted to ask the kids, why don't you let me play? And so I asked my uncle, who was a pastor in South Dakota, and he didn't know any more than I did. And then I asked my father, and he didn't know anything either. And so I enjoyed the fact that they were so ignorant and I knew something that they didn't know. And so then we got to the point after in school, my father said, look, what you should do is yell, throw me the ball. Throw me the ball. And so there I was. The kids were all playing baseball, and I was way out in right field, and the ball came to me, and I looked at it, and I remembered the words, throw me the ball, and whoosh, the ball came to me. But it wasn't any good, because I didn't know what to do with it once it came. But we do make choices. We do need to make choices. Let me illustrate what I'm trying to say. You see, when we take a look at our lives, we will remember that we need to make ourselves available to God. But there's a catch to it. Not a catch as far as our faith is concerned, but there's a catch to it because we don't want to turn our lives over to God. We want God to turn everything towards us and for us. And there was a community, a village, probably something as large as Sulphur Springs. And in this particular community, they had a wise man. Is there anybody here who wants to volunteer to be a wise man? I don't see anybody. I could select some people, but that wouldn't count, would it? But this particular community did have a wise man. And he was able to tell people how to live their lives, and it worked very well. And then one day, a 12-year-old was playing by himself, throwing the ball up and catching it. You know how many of you, all of us, have done that. And so the wise man was known, and it was a challenge to everyone. And one day, the 12-year-old came to another friend of his and said, I finally figured out how to get the wise man, how to show that he isn't all that wise. That he isn't really all that wise. And so he says, why? Show us. And he said, look, I'll show you right now. He said, I've caught this little bird, and I have it in my hand. And this little bird is going to help me show you that God himself is present, but show him and more importantly, show us the way to prove that he's not all that wise. And so the two of them got together and they walked to this wise man who lived in a cave, and they walked up to him and said, wise man, I have something in my hand. It's either dead or it's alive. And you're going to help me prove that the wise man doesn't know. And so they went there, and they thought to themselves, I can show this. I can show the fact that if the man says the bird is alive, all I will do is squeeze until the bird is dead. And if you show me, or if you challenge me to actually make the bird come alive, all I have to show you is take my hand and open it, and the bird will fly away. Hey, that seemed like a good plan. And so they approached the wise man and said, Wise man, is the bird alive in my hand, or is it dead? And the wise man looked at the boys and said, it's in your hands. It's in your hands. You see, every one of us has a choice to make. And the choice that we have to make is whether we're going to be alive to God or whether we're going to be dead. The choice is all the way through Scripture. I bet we could sit down together and take us an hour, if not longer, to demonstrate and illustrate that in fact the wise man isn't wise. But that doesn't mean we don't have to challenge. That doesn't mean that we don't have to choose. Amen.